My name is Lee Smith. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I thank you for joining us this afternoon at our panel. I will tell you this will be a very interesting panel, a very special panel, and I think it will be something like you have not seen before. We have three extremely accomplished and interesting panelists. To my immediate left is Michael Duran, a colleague here at Hudson Institute. And I urge all of you, if you have not already read Mike's article in Mosaic magazine about the administration's secret nuclear deal with Iran. It's making the rounds. It's a must-read in town, and for understandable reasons. So I urge you to read it, and Mr. Duran will have some interesting things to say this afternoon. To his left is Matthew Koenig, a professor at Georgetown University and also the author of A Time to Attack. Professor Koenig knows a tremendous amount not only about the Iranian nuclear weapons program, but about the history of proliferation over the course of the last century as well. Really fascinating, a fascinating writer, fascinating thinker, and I know he'll have some wonderful things to say this afternoon. To his left is David Samuels, one of the premier journalists, narrative journalists especially of his generation, who has also written about nuclear issues. Most startlingly was a profile for The New Yorker in 2007 about a truck driver who figured out how to reverse engineer the bombs that the United States dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. David will have some fascinating things to say as well. And again, I promise you an interesting and fascinating panel. And thank you again for coming. And right now, I'm going to ask Mike Duran to make some introductory comments.
Thanks, Lee. And thanks to all of you for coming. I think I'd like to start by discussing the story that the Obama administration is telling us, because I think the basic story that they're telling about the Iran deal is fundamentally false. The story starts, that they tell, starts with the election of Hassan Rouhani in Iran, and supposedly that election led to a new spirit in Iran, a desire to make a strategic shift, to engage more with the world, to be less confrontational with the United States and the international community. And that spirit then was reflected in a decision to sit down with the United States and negotiate over the nuclear question. The Iranians made supposedly made some very significant concessions up front, which allowed for this for these negotiations. And then the negotiations have been very fruitful. The very fact that the Iranians have sat down with us for 18 months and negotiated is pointed to by John Kerry, among others, as evidence that there has been a strategic shift and a change on the part of the Iranians. Also, the administration quietly, it doesn't publicly say it so much, but quietly, it suggests that there has been a shift by the regime, and that the deal itself will bring about a greater shift, some kind of transformation of Iranian behavior. They make this argument in a number of different ways. Moderates are going to be elevated over extremists, or just the give and take of a mutually beneficial, mutually dependent relationship with the United States is going to change the options as understood in Tehran and moderate their behavior. And so on. I think that all of this is fundamentally false, as I said. The negotiations have been fueled from the beginning by major U.S. concessions. There have been Iranian concessions, to be sure, but they pale in comparison to what the concessions that the Americans have made. And the Iranians have consistently followed, or they have consistently pursued three major interests. One of them is to retain all of their nuclear infrastructure. The second is to have the sanctions regime completely lifted. And the third is to have Iran no longer regarded as a rogue nation, to be a nation like any other, to get rid of the legal regime that regards them as a pariah state. We have given them all of those things in substance. And we're in with the possible exception of the sanctions, the complete lifting of the sanctions. The president is talking about a phased lifting of the sanctions. But he's talking about when the deal is signed, such an incredible economic benefit to the Iranians up front that it amounts to a gutting of the sanctions legislation. The other thing is that the Iranians have been paid to negotiate. They get $700 million a month in sanctions relief to negotiate. So when I look at this, I don't see any evidence for the case that there has been a strategic shift on the part of the Iranians. I haven't seen the administration really make that case. I think that they have relied on the optics of the U.S. sitting down with the Iranians as itself, just that picture after 30 years of confrontation, that picture alone kind of makes the case for the administration, and they've never been forced to defend it. So what I fear when I look at this and I ask, is this a good deal, is this a bad deal? I think, first of all, what's a good deal look like? A good deal is one that if it fails, because we have to admit up front that this is a risky proposition, making a deal with the Iranians. If it fails, the United States will not be in a substantially worse position than it was before we made the deal. Secondly, a good deal is one that makes our allies in the region feel comfortable. And I think that this deal that's being made fails on both those counts, because we have paid them up front, and we are constructing a deal that is going to pay them even more. The most credible report about the signing bonus that they're going to receive for making the deal is $50 billion. $50 billion, and then the president is going to take this to the United Nations Security Council, and the Security Council will vote for the agreement, which will free up the Europeans and the Chinese and others, the Russians, to do both economic and military deals with the Iranians. So they'll get an enormous financial boost, plus their position, their status in international relations will change overnight. If the deal fails, then it will be impossible to go back to where we were. To go back to where we were, not just to go back to where we were in 2012 when we had them on the ropes, but it would be impossible to go back to where we are now. So we've actually incentivized them. If they have not made a strategic shift, and I see no reason to believe that they have, we've incentivized them to sign the deal in order to pocket the signing bonus, and then to go and proceed toward their weapons capability as they always have. As they always have in the past. And then just one more statement about or a couple of more sentences about about making the allies nervous. This has tremendously unsettled the region, because while we have been negotiating this deal, we have turned a blind eye to the expansion of Iranian influence throughout the region, which is very troubling to all of our allies. The Israelis have been most vocal about it, but what Benjamin Netanyahu said when he came here and spoke before Congress is what is felt in the hearts of all of the U.S. allies. Some of them, like the Saudis, have been more obvious in expressing their distaste, and their intervention in Yemen was a signal to the United States. It was, of course, prompted by events on the ground in Yemen, but it was also a way of saying, if you're not going to organize the region against the Iranians, then we will. Other powers, like the Kuwaitis, are simply hedging. They can see which direction U.S. policy is going in. So they're not going to. They know they can't change our policy. They know they can't stand up to the Iranians. So they're just trying to make nice with the Iranians because they realize that they are the new boss that we are setting them up to be the new boss in the region. So there's a complete disconnect. A good deal has to be one that is integrated into a regional policy that makes sense. The president is saying that he has a policy of containing Iran in the region, but there is no one, I would defy anyone to point to an actual set of actions on the ground that are part of a coherent containment strategy. So in effect, what this nuclear deal is it's part and parcel of a larger policy that is simply empowering Iran throughout the region, and that story is going to end very badly because it's going to lead to not to the equilibrium that the president is talking about, but to disequilibrium. Thank you.
Mike, thanks. That's terrific. I'm going to ask you to come back later when we're.
I'm going to throw
after
water.
After you've thrown water at everyone.
Don't you dare disagree with me.
Yes, I'm going to ask you to come back around and talk a little bit about Yemen, because I think there's a lot of mistaken assumptions about what's been happening in Yemen, about the administration's role. So I'm going to ask you to come back later and put that in terms of the administration's regional policy. So thanks very much. Matt, if you would like to follow up.
Great. Well, thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Hudson Institute. Thanks to all of you for coming out and spending your lunch with us. The question of the proposed panel is what's wrong with the Iran nuclear deal? And I think a lot of people have been tackling this question, kind of looking at the details. Will we get access to military sites? Will Iran get sanctions relief up front? How will we work out the sanctions relief? And I actually think all those details are really irrelevant. Because I think what's wrong with the nuclear deal is bigger than that, and it's simply that we're allowing Iran to enrich and legitimating Iran's enrichment program in the first place. So I'll take the next 5 or 10 minutes to make this point, and I'll make kind of 3 supporting arguments. So the first is that the United States has always had a pretty strong preference, if not policy, toward prohibiting the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies to any country. So many of you who understand nuclear issues probably already know this, but the United States has essentially drawn a line between peaceful nuclear technology, which is research reactors, power reactors, and the ability to make fuel for those reactors. So having the reactors was fine, but making the fuel, enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium, was a problem, because once you can make the fuel, you can make fuel for either nuclear reactors, but also for nuclear weapons. So going all the way back to 1946 with the McMahon Act, the United States Congress made it illegal to cooperate on these technologies with any country, including our closest allies like Britain and Canada, who had just been helping us years before on the Manhattan Project. Fast forward a little bit to the 1970s, the Indian nuclear test in 1974. The United States, Henry Kissinger, set up this nuclear suppliers group, which got some of the advanced nuclear powers together and essentially set up a cartel to prohibit and restrict the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing to any country. And when those controls failed, the United States has gone on the offense to try to stop countries from doing this stuff, even our close allies. So in the 1970s, South Korea and Taiwan, both allies, were trying to reprocess plutonium, and we put a lot of pressure on them, forced them to shut those programs down. One Taiwanese scientist afterwards said, when the United States got through with us, I'm surprised we're allowed to still teach physics on Taiwan. And then, the United States has negotiated with rogue nations over nuclear programs in the past. So we can think of the successful Libya nuclear deal in 2003. We can think of the failed series of failed deals with North Korea, starting with the agreed framework in 1994. But those deals had one thing in common. They prohibited enrichment and reprocessing. We weren't bargaining over how much enrichment, how much reprocessing. That was taken for granted that those things wouldn't be allowed. So when Iran started enriching in 2003, the United States' response was simple. It was based on past policy. Enrichment in Iran will not be tolerated. So that was our policy for over a decade. We got 6 UN Security Council resolutions saying that Iran should suspend enrichment. And I actually, for another reason, was going back and I read President Obama's, then candidate Obama's Foreign Affairs article in 2007 when he was making the case for his presidency. And early on in the article, he said that as president, he will, quote, stop Iran's uranium enrichment program. So he didn't say he would keep Iran from the bomb. He said he would stop its enrichment program. And so we've come a long way from that now. What this deal does is accept and legitimate Iran's enrichment program, allows it to keep 6,000 centrifuges, and we're calling it a comprehensive deal. So we've really climbed down a long way from this bipartisan non-proliferation standard. Second point is, I don't think it solves the problem it's intended to solve in Iran. By leaving Iran so close to a nuclear weapons threshold capability, I think it makes it more likely after a deal than before a deal that Iran eventually gets nuclear weapons or we're forced to take other actions to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And the metaphor I sometimes use is, speaking to my students, I'm a professor at Georgetown University, think that the concern is that Iran will speed, that it's in a car, it might go over 60 miles an hour. And so the way we've always dealt with this problem is to say, you can't even have a car. Somebody can drive you, to get an Uber, have a bicycle, take the metro, but you can't have a car. And what this deal does instead is essentially say, okay, you can have a car, you can be on the racetrack, and you can go 35 miles an hour, but you can't go 36 miles an hour. And so, we're letting them get pretty close to what we're trying to prevent. And so the problem with that, of course, is, first of all, it's hard to monitor and verify. If they don't have a car at all, it's easy to tell when they're trying to buy a car, when they're getting into the car. If they don't have enrichment at all, it's pretty easy to tell if there's trying to procure components on the international marketplace and other things. But if you allow them to have this program so close, verifying violations is very difficult. And then if they decide to step on the gas and go from 35 to 60, there's very little we can do at that point to intervene and stop them. So I think it makes it hard to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. And moreover, it legitimates the program. If Iran is going to enrich, it would be much better for them to enrich under UN Security Council resolutions saying that this is a violation, under international opprobrium, under international sanctions. Instead, what the deal does is give them a clean bill of health and say it's fine for Iran to have this nuclear weapons breakout capability. In addition, it sets a bad precedent. So the United States has towed this tough no enrichment, no reprocessing line for a long time, including with allies. But once we make an exception for Iran, a country that's essentially a U.S. enemy, a country that's violated its non-proliferation commitments in the past, then it becomes very difficult to go to other countries and say, we trust Iran with uranium enrichment technology, but we don't trust you. So already, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates have said whatever rights and capabilities Iran gets, we want the exact same. And so I'm afraid that what this is going to do is set a precedent. Other countries are going to try to claim similar technologies that's going to lead to further spread of nuclear weapons and weaken the non-proliferation regime. Third and final point is, I think there is an alternative to this deal. So that's an argument that supporters often make is, well, it's this deal or war, so this deal is better. And that's clearly not the case. So going back a few years, we had this red line of no enrichment in Iran. The Supreme Leader also set his red lines. The Supreme Leader has said, I won't dismantle a single enrichment facility. Well, first of all, I will enrich and we won't close a single facility. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is we've caved on our red lines and the Supreme Leader has kept his. So we've gotten this deal because we've moved towards the Supreme Leader's position. But there was no reason we had to do that. We're in the stronger position and we need to recognize that. Iran is the country that's violating international law. Iran is the one that has multiple UN Security Council resolutions against it. Iran is the country whose economy nearly collapsed because of these sanctions. Iran is the country whose nuclear program would be a pile of gravel tomorrow morning if the president changed his mind on the use of military force. So we're holding all the cards. There was no reason for us to cave. So if the president had simply said, your Supreme Leader has red lines, that's great, I have red lines too. My red line is enrichment. Enrichment's not allowed. And so we'd given the Iranians a choice. So you can keep enriching, but it's going to mean continued international isolation, continued sanctions, and if that all fails, military strikes on your nuclear facilities. Or you can give up enrichment. You can have a big peaceful nuclear energy program. You can have the sanctions lifted. You can have whatever other kind of goodies you want, and no enrichment. I think it's pretty clear that eventually Iran would have caved. And there's no way to know that for certain, but at a minimum, we should test it. There's no reason to cave for this weak deal now. So I think I'll end my remarks there and look forward to your questions and comments.
Matt, thanks very much. That's terrific. I just want to point out that the history that you tell, that this is the first time we've acknowledged someone else's right to enrich like this, I think that puts in context also what Mike was saying before about the Iranians being paid to negotiate. Once we've given them something as big as acknowledging their right to enrich, every concession after that effectively becomes a payment for them to continue sitting at the table. So thanks to you both. David, I'm going to ask you to follow up.
Yes, and I want to underline two words that Matthew used, which were bipartisan consensus. Unlike many of you, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, I'm not involved in partisan politics. I've generally considered myself to be a liberal Democrat. These principles, historically, are non-controversial ones. They've been embraced by every American administration since World War II. To find them being undone in this very rapid way, given the potential consequences of unchecked nuclear proliferation, not just in the region, but also in Asia, is and should be a terrifying thing for Americans to contemplate. Whatever their feelings about this president or Republicans or Democrats, as someone who has reported in and around questions relating to nuclear programs and gray market economies, I am startled by the lack of attention and clarity that is, obvious in the way these stories are being reported. And I was intending to open with two pleasantries which are not disconnected from the body of what I want to say. The first is that it's a pleasure to be here at the Hudson Institute. And it's a pleasure because the Hudson Institute was founded by Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn was, of course, a master of what my friend Edward Lutwak calls the paradoxical logic of strategic thinking. Kahn's work, as I'm sure many of you know, was extraordinarily important in guiding the United States through the very real dangers of the Cold War, which culturally we seem to be forgetting. And that work in turn was founded, of course, on the work of John von Neumann and others in game theory and related fields. That logic was once something that American policymakers and the people who wrote about them understood. It was part of their common language. That language seems foreign now to public discussion, and that's a shame. The second pleasantry that I wanted to offer was that it's great to be here in Washington. One of the reasons why I like Washington is that the number of people involved in broadly what's now called the media has doubled here in the last 5 to 10 years. It's really the only city in which that's true in America. A recent study by the Pew Foundation estimated that a total of 50,000 jobs have been lost in the American press in the last 10 years. I can tell you, as someone who made my living in this field exclusively for the last 25 years, that 50,000 people is rather a lot. It's probably about half the reporting capacity that the US public has access to. What happens to a democratic society when you decide to do away with the institutions of a free press, because that is the decision that, without knowing it, our country has made. I had lunch last fall with a person named Jeb Bush, and over the course of that lunch, he raised a funny question. He looked at me and he said, well, do you know why companies like Amazon and Facebook are not subject to antitrust legislation? And I said, no. Do you? And he said, no. I think it's strange. And I said, I agree with you. Now, I bring this up not to make fun of Jeb Bush. In fact, I bring it up to praise him because it is the only time that I've heard a leading American politician of either party even raise this question. The question, at least, occurred to him. I think we are having what is a very, very consequential debate right now about not a specific deal and not the Obama administration, but and not just American posture in the Middle East. Who do we wish to ally ourselves with? How friendly do we want to really be with Saudi Arabia? Is Iran really that bad? All of these questions pale next to the prospect of unchecked nuclear proliferation in a world where the United States has decided that it will no longer enforce the very, very basic structures that we set in place after World War II in order to prevent the horror of a world in which many, many states, some of them led by people whose perceptions of reality depart from our own in very significant ways, are armed with weapons whose capacity to kill hundreds of thousands of people and to destroy, if used in great numbers, the most basic functioning of not just individual societies, but of large chunks of the global system that feeds and provides basic security to billions of human beings on the planet. This is a terrifying, terrifying prospect. And that's what's at stake in this deal. And the inability of people to recognize that that is what we are talking about is in part tied to the institutional collapse of the structures in which I spent a good deal of my own life working. I don't think it's because of venality or greed or political partisanship on this person's part or that person's part. There is a much larger collapse that is affecting our ability as a society to understand the questions that are before us. And that's what I want to say.
David, thank you. That's terrific. I'm going to try to, actually, I do believe there is a common thread coming out. I'm going to make it as banal as possible. But look, this deal represents that something significant is changing. You've put it in terms of, I know that you and I have talked about this before, in terms of the structure that is part of our Cold War legacy. And part of the reason we don't recognize this is because the structures of the media are changing. Matt, you were saying that this is, in 70 years of American policy, we have never allowed this to happen before. And Mike, you're talking about how, we've talked about this before, strategic realignment, why the United States seems to, or why the Obama administration seems to be pointed toward another direction. So actually, I'm just going to ask us or ask you guys rather, to talk about this. And actually, Matt, I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, if you can just say, look, I know it's hard to do the psychology or sociology of the administration, but why? Why have we changed? Why in 70 years? Why, if, as you said, the president, then candidate Obama said, yeah, I'm not going to allow them to enrich. What happened?
Yeah. First thing I guess I would point out is, I made the argument in the opening statement, so let me work in some of the nuance. I mean, there are other countries in the world that enrich, but this has never been something that the United States has supported, and over time we've gotten tougher about enforcing this. So what is unprecedented about the Iran deal, though, is a country of proliferation concern, a country that's hostile to the United States, and rather than sticking to this no enrichment, no reprocessing point of view, we're willing to haggle over it and to allow them to have a program. Again, that's not something we're willing to do with Libya, with North Korea, and even with our allies in the past when we had the ability to do something about it. So what's changed? I mean, I think the argument the administration would make for this is, I think it's focused on the specific case and not thinking broadly about the precedent it's setting and what it means for the future of nonproliferation. And I think they understand that if Iran's program continues to advance, that we might face this choice of living with a nuclear-armed Iran, which would be bad, I think we can all agree, or taking military action, which is also bad, but less bad than nuclear-armed Iran. I think most reasonable people agree on that. And I think they badly want to avoid those outcomes. And so they say that no deal is better than a bad deal, but I'm not sure that they believe it. I think that any deal that allows them to avoid making this tough choice between living with a nuclear-armed Iran or striking is good for them, or that's how they perceive it. So I think that's what's driving it, a sense that there are even worse outcomes out there, and so a bad deal is better than no deal.
I see. Mike, I was going to ask you, I mean, I believe we've talked about this, that the deal on the Iranian nuclear program is only one part of the conversation between the United States and Iran. If you can, if you'd like, if you can fill that in a little bit more, because again, where I do want to talk a little bit about now and say, what is different? Why is this, why is the conversation that all of us here in this room are having, why could this have not happened 5-10 years ago?
I'll definitely answer that. Can I just add a footnote to something David said?
Yeah, please do.
Because
Sure.
It struck me, perhaps it struck many of you, that the response to the Kissinger-Schultz op-ed, the recent op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, wasn't what I thought it would be. When I read that op-ed, which I'm sure everybody here has read, I thought it was just devastating to the administration, and all the more devastating for containing no adjectives, just for containing no adjectives, and not attacking the administration, just raising questions, and very methodically going through all the holes that they saw in it, and then to have two distinguished secretaries of state raise these issues, and then the spokeswoman for the State Department said, you know, it contains a lot of big words and big ideas, but I don't see anything else in it. Right. And I don't think I don't think that 10 years ago, when we had a more vibrant, a more self-confident press, that would have gone by with as little impact as it had. Now, I do believe that was a very important op-ed, and I do believe it had a lot of impact. But I think in an earlier era, that would have driven a very, very consequential discussion for at least a couple of weeks, and the administration would have been roundly criticized for that response to it. But with regard to what you're saying, you know, Matt just said that that the real position of the administration is that a bad deal is better than no deal. And I agree with that. In my view, the administration has very cleverly convinced much of the world, and even a lot of its critics, that it is engaged in an arms control agreement, that its strategic goal is to achieve an arms control agreement. And I don't think that that's actually how the president sees it. I think the president sees the arms control agreement as a vehicle for achieving détente with Iran. That's the strategic goal. It is, in his eyes, détente with Iran that is going to moderate them in the nuclear field. It's détente with Iran that is going to pay dividends in the region. He looks at this region. He sees it as a huge mess. He sees the defining experience of his life with respect to Middle East policy is the Iraq War. Repeating the folly of George W. Bush's Iraq War, as the president sees it, is the thing to be avoided at all costs. He wants to pull the United States back from the Middle East, end wars, and spend much less time and effort and resources in managing the region. So the minute you decide you're going to pull the United States back, it leads inevitably. There's a logic train here that's just that's inevitable. And it leads to the first thing: no more containment of Iran. Because containment of Iran forces you to be very, very concerned about the structures on the ground and building them up, and then it potentially sucks the United States back into the kind of conflict with Iraq in Iraq that we had. And in fact, it was in Iraq that I think he first started realizing. If he hadn't already, he might have already, but it was certainly in the context of the status of forces agreement that he began to think of Iran as a potential force for stability in the region. He was confident that he could pull the forces out of Iraq because there would be other forces on the ground that would keep Iraq stable enough that it would allow the United States to play a role as a kind of offshore balancer. The only force that could do that is Iran. That was never said. The president has never said it. But anybody who's looked closely at Iraq policy over the last decade knows just how influential Iran is in Iraq. And so there had to be a calculation that we can pull back because Iran will take care of business. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a de facto alignment with Iran in Iraq. You saw it clearly in the case of Tikrit, where U.S. air power drove the Islamic State out, and then Iranian-backed militias came in and took over on the ground. You see a similar process at work in Syria. In Yemen, Iran isn't seen as the essential pillar, but you ask about Yemen before. The U.S. put warships in the Gulf of Aden and made a dramatic display of flexing muscles, but what it was actually doing in the diplomacy was bringing Iran into the diplomacy against the will of the Saudis and forcing the Saudis to negotiate with the Iranians. And in fact, in some ways, negotiating with the Iranians over the heads of the Saudis. So in many ways, and certainly in certain arenas, and possibly throughout the whole region, the president is now seeing Iran as his primary interlocutor, and everybody else is second, including Israel, including Saudi Arabia.
David, Mike tells an interesting story. It's an interesting story about the administration, how it sees the Middle East. You tell stories. It's what you do for a living. Can you how can we be convinced? How can our audience be convinced that the story that we're telling about the administration, how it looks at the Middle East, about the nuclear weapons deal, what are the points that we need to really hit on to say this is not just a story, we're not making this up, it's not a biography of the president's Middle East view, it's a real thing?
I think, as I suggested in my opening remarks, that there's been a real failure to frame the stakes of this deal, what it means, not just for American Mideast policy, but for America's global posture, and what the effect on these structures that we've built over 70 years to enforce a relatively successful regime of non-proliferation, the success of that regime being judged by the fact that no one has used nuclear weapons since we did it. That is something that we take for granted now. I'm suggesting that there's nothing inevitable about that. That happened because we did specific things and we backed the things that we wanted to do up with very, very significant applications of political and economic pressure and through credible threats of force. That didn't happen by magic. I think that the belief that we can take our hand off that wheel and see what happens if we experiment with a world in which we throw out all this Cold War blather and just let people kind of do what they want with these technologies and weapons. That doesn't seem like an experiment that's likely to end well for humans. Except that's the experiment that we may be embarking on now. And so the first question is a question of framing. I think that all of these debates over how many centrifuges will be allowed to continue operating in Fordo and what they'll be allowed to reprocess have accepted a framing that makes it more and more likely for people to simply dismiss what they're hearing and go back to whatever their normal partisan alignment is.
Why? Because it's too complicated?
Because it's very complicated, and what's the worst thing that could happen? Actually, the worst thing that can happen here is something very, very bad. That's the first thing. Now, there's two other things, and I think that the administration's use of language is very important, and there are specific phrases which I see again and again. I know I question whether these phrases are being used, out of ignorance or whether they are deliberately framed, and I think the answer is probably it depends who's using them. I wanted to focus on two of those phrases today because they're both very important. The first is one that the president and people around him have been using repeatedly in the past few weeks, which is snapback. Snapback. Now, snapback, this is a thing that we're being told is going to be built in to any deal. So if we catch Iran violating the terms, if there are terms written down for this deal, we're going to have this mechanism called snapback, in which we can immediately reapply the sanctions regime that we dismantled. And this sounds, when you hear it, and if you don't know anything really about these mechanisms and what they actually consist of, like a plausible and reasonable thing. Well, what happens if you catch them violating the deal because those Iranians, they're sneaky, maybe they have bad intentions? Well, that's no problem. We'll snap back the sanctions that we have, and then we haven't really lost anything. As someone who's spent a lot of time in different reporting endeavors involving gray and black market goods, I can assure you that there is no such thing as snapback sanctions. If you look at the history of how sanctions are actually applied, assuming that everyone's agreed on what the sanction is and what it should look like, what follows after that is an incredibly arduous, on-the-ground process, country by country, port by port, street by street, agency by agency, inside countries that are not necessarily immediately willing to do what you want, in order to shut down front companies, banks, to install safeguards at ports, to fire people who sell licenses at specific ports. This is a global endeavor that takes years. It takes years to get a sanctions regime to work. And they don't work perfectly. All you do with a sanctions regime, as you know, I don't know how many of you know, have any of you ever bought anything illegal?
Well, let's see a show of hands.
Well, if you have bought something illegal, whatever that is, I'm not going to ask, you know that in fact things that are illegal are available. You can still buy them. What happens when you make something illegal? Well, you raise the cost of that good. You can get a nice bottle of whiskey in Saudi Arabia. It's not really a big problem. It's just a little bit of a pain in the ass, and it costs 3 times as much as that bottle of whiskey does in New York. But it's the same whiskey. Sanctions regimes work the same way. They are financial penalties that target particular areas of endeavor. Fine. You want to buy rotary blades that can be used in certain kinds of industrial processes that may be related to uranium. You can't fill out a purchase order for that and buy them from the companies that make them in Switzerland. You're going to have to go through a whole rigmarole where you're going to find some rogue South African guy who has a metal shop and stole some equipment, and he's not even going to be able to make you those blades. He's going to be able to give you parts of machinery that you may or may not be able to use to make those blades, and that process is going to end up taking a lot of time, and each of those blades is now going to cost you 10 times what it would have cost you before, and you've raised the possibility that maybe they're not made as well as they could have been. And maybe your machines won't work all that well. And so what this is basically a tax. And it is a tax that doesn't make it impossible. It just makes it very, very costly. And certainly anyone who's looked at the efforts of AQ Khan to set up his Khan network, which successfly gave Pakistan the ability to manufacture nuclear weapons. That effort was something that took a logistical genius, a great deal of time, and cost a great deal of money.
This is interesting, actually. I wanted to ask you something about this, and actually I wanted to ask Matt about this too. You and I have talked about this some, and Matt, I believe you and I have as well. Why has it taken the Iranians so long to get this far? Why 25 years? If you would talk about that for a second, and then Matt, I'm going to ask you as well.
Okay, and this relates to the second little phrase that I wanted to air out, which is you can't bomb knowledge. The short answer to that one is, of course you can. But it also mistakes in a significant way what is hard.
But before that, I just want to make clear that David Samuels has the plans for a nuclear weapon.
I do.
And
I have the knowledge myself at home in my desk
and so
drawer.
we're establishing a campaign of deterrence to keep him and his family from using the bomb. So we're going to deter and contain you.
No,
Why do you have it in your at
Because
home in your drawer? You have the
I
plans for a
I have
nuclear
plans
weapon?
for a working nuclear device. Yeah, I do, given to me by my truck driver, and the head of the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory actually looked over the plans and said that they are actually.
But I mean, it really does go to the point, though, that you can't. Look, if you have it seriously, if you have
knowledge
it in your
is
home,
not knowledge is not the hard part. And this question of why has it taken Iran 25 years to still not be able? Now we don't know, and I think it's a very interesting question. We don't know how much of the North Korean nuclear program is actually part of the Iranian nuclear program. It's a very significant question. How much of their program is now off-site, meaning not physically located in Iran? To return to the question of why 25 years, the short answer is because it's very hard. And the slightly longer answer is that there are two kinds. There's a meaningful distinction that can be made between an indigenous nuclear program and a non-indigenous nuclear program, right? If Germany tomorrow were to decide that it had a pressing need for a, 10 or 12 nuclear bombs. Germany could, in a crash program, probably create those devices for itself in 3 months or less. Why? Because Germany is a fully industrialized state with all of the capacities and technologies needed in a nuclear program already there, and the only thing it would have to do is arrange those blocks in a particular order, and they would have bombs. Japan, a country where I have spent some time, it is not a huge secret among people who are familiar with the Japanese nuclear program that Japan does have a program. Japan is not a nuclear state. They do not have nuclear weapons. However, there is a program by which Japan, if it felt itself to be under some form of imminent nation threat, would be able to assemble nuclear weapons from components that it has produced. These are among the not very well kept secrets of the nuclear world. So now you know them too.
Yeah. I just want to get Matt's take on this too.
Yeah. So I agree with David, one, that it's very hard. You may have heard that when the Iranians were first trying to enrich uranium, they were having problems with their centrifuges spinning out of control and crashing on the ground. So you have to spin these centrifuges at the speed of sound, which obviously getting a metal cylinder to spin at the speed of sound is difficult. And what they figured out is that they had been handling the centrifuges with their bare hands, and just the oil from human hands were enough to throw them off. So they figured out they had to wear special gloves. So I think a lot of it is the technical challenge.
Which not insignificantly is something that someone in Germany would have thought of before they turned it on.
Probably.
No, that is very interesting.
So the technical part is difficult, but I think there's also been political reasons why Iran has moderated its program over the years. So the only time Iran has been willing to put curbs on the program has been when its back was against the wall. So in 2003, it stopped its uranium program for a while, in large part, we believe, because the United States had just invaded Iraq, and Iran was afraid that it might be next, and that pursuing WMD was the way you got on the Pentagon's target list, and so they stopped in 2003. And then over the past 16 months, as we've talked about, they've been willing to come to the table. They've been willing to put some curbs, not meaningful curbs really in my view, but some curbs on their nuclear program over the past 16 months, in part because their economy was nearing collapse because of the sanctions. So I think what that shows is that when their back is against the wall, they are willing to make concessions. So I think that also undermines the administration's argument that there are no alternatives. I think if we return to the pressure track, we can bring enough pressure to bear to where they would be willing to put more curbs on the program. And just one final point on this. So it is difficult. It has taken them a long time, but they're basically there now. In order to build nuclear weapons, Iran needs to get the fissile material. It needs to be able to form it into a nuclear device, and then it needs to be able to deliver that to an opponent. But really, all that matters is the first stage, because once they have the material, the game's really over. Right now, we can strike the enrichment facilities to prevent them from enriching uranium, but once they have significant quantities of highly enriched uranium, they can take that material and move it anywhere. We wouldn't necessarily know where it is. It could be beyond the reach of our best bunker-busting weapons. So at that point, our non-proliferation policy would become praying that they don't weaponize, which isn't a good place to be in. So the key is to stop them from producing one bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium. And the best estimates are now that if the Supreme Leader made the decision to dash to a nuclear weapons capability, that he would be there in about 2 to 3 months. And with this deal, if we get this Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a final deal, all that does is, according to the administration's estimates, extend that breakout time to 12 months. But some outside experts who've looked at the same problem have come up with shorter estimates. Ali Heinonen, who had formerly worked at the International Atomic Energy Agency on the Iran file, estimates that even with the final deal in place, that Iran's breakout time would be 8 months. So Iran is very close. So some people say, well, Iran's been 2 or 3 years away from a bomb for decades. Why should we worry about it? I think some of those estimates in the past were bad estimates, but we know a lot about Iran's program now, and they are very close. So I think we have a problem and we need to do something about it.
I wanted to move on to one. Go ahead very quickly if you want to follow up. But I have a big abstract conceptual question I want to run by you all.
Very quickly, I wanted to say that the significance of the distinction between what we can call an indigenous nuclear program and a non-indigenous nuclear program, right? The difference between a Germany or a Japan or a country like Iran or a country like Pakistan, which has assembled a nuclear program really through logistics, moving components, and the ability to make certain kinds of components into their country and then being able to assemble those things correctly. The difference is whether or not the program is replicable, right? Germany can make a bomb because all of the knowledge and all of the many industrial components and subsets are already there. If you've gained a significant proportion of those things by having them smuggled into your country, that's not a reflection of your ability to build all of those things on your own. That's a reflection of your ability to fill out fake bills of lading and hide things in, say that they're washing machines. I'm not very sure where the estimates of, well, if we attacked Iran's nuclear program, it would only set them back 2 or 3 years anyway. Therefore, that's not a reasonable thing to think about. I think that it's just as likely that a real set of strikes on the stuff that it's taken Iran 20 years to be able to physically assemble is simply something that's not replicable for them at all.
I always like to hear someone make the case for striking the Iranian nuclear facilities. So thank you.
I'm not making that case. I'm just
no,
saying. I'm saying. I'm
All
just
right,
saying
then
it is.
Michael make it.
I'm saying it is a very strange thing as a reporter to hear these things being, given this common currency and common
Sure,
wisdom when
no one is
actually
asking
they
and
don't
saying,
make much
right,
sense.
this doesn't make sense. That's kind of what I was getting at with the question. If it's taken 25 years or something like that to get to where they are now, why is the common wisdom that, well, at best, the best case scenario, we can only set them back a couple years? And I've spoken with Matt about that as well. Both Matt and David disagree from different angles, but for excellent reasons. The question that I want to ask is, because another thing that I'm hearing is, in different ways, what you're saying is, what all of you are saying in different ways is, the Cold War is over, right? So Obama is, thank goodness, he has the opportunity and the perspective to lead us away from some of these Cold War policies, whether this was the embargo with Cuba, whether this was 36 years of hostility with the Islamic Republic. We don't need these anymore. And when you're talking about 70 years of proliferation policy, it's like the world has changed. It's different. No one's going to say it's easy, but it's a different place. We don't need the Saudis and the Israelis the same way that we did in the Cold War. Maybe the Iranians are a better bet right now. So maybe we are the ones who are resisting and saying the problem is ours, right? Why is the problem the administration's worldview and not ours, who are resisting being ushered out of the Cold War era and into something new and, granted, difficult, but maybe better? Mike, if you would, I was going to.
Well, I would just look at what they say their goals are, and then what they say the means that they are using to achieve those goals. And when you look at it under a microscope, you see that you're not going to get there from here. We're not going to stop Iran with this deal. Another argument in terms of the regional breakout that concerns me, another argument that is being made on behalf of the administration, and I think the administration believes this, although it doesn't say it, is that Iran is our de facto ally against Sunni radicalism, and that they're helping us fight the Islamic State. I think that is a completely erroneous view of how the Middle East works. I think it's a completely erroneous view of what's driving the recruitment and of the Islamic State and its ability to hold on to territory. and without going into great detail, and we've talked about this on other panels, but when the Sunnis of Iraq, who are not supportive of the Islamic State, see the United States help Iran effectively take Tikrit, and then they see Shiite militias that are rapacious sectarian actors that are going to kill every military-aged Sunni male that they come across. When they see that, they immediately recoil from the United States. They recoil from the Iraqi government, and they certainly recoil from those Shiite militias and from Iran. And so by that operation in Tikrit, we made the ability of forces sympathetic to us to take Mosul and hold it that much harder, because every military-aged Sunni male in Iraq is going to fight for Mosul, and they'll fight side by side with the Islamic State, because as bad as the Islamic State is, the alternative is much worse. So, simply put, we're alienating all the Sunnis of the Middle East, and they are the majority of the population there. And we're doing it while we're saying that we're aligning with Iran that's going to help us with ISIS. Right. It's not going to work. So if our goal of doing this is to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, I mean, Matt has explained to us that that's probably unlikely. If our goal for doing this is that it's going to help us stabilize the Middle East, it's not going to help us stabilize the Middle East.
What if it's not about stabilizing the Middle East, though? Not that it's trying to create chaos in the Middle East, but what if look, we have talked about this before, I think on other panels as well. How much of this is theater, and how much of it is policy?
Theater to what audience, you mean?
I think in lots of ways to a domestic audience.
Well, I think
we're worried about the Islamic State, so we're going to wage a campaign against them on the ground in Iraq. And I think a lot of people would say, this campaign actually hasn't been very serious. Another part of the theater is, and this is kind of what David is getting at when he's talking about how the media is covering this, another part of the theater is, yes, we're going to stop Iran from getting a bomb. And that's why we're sitting down, and the only alternative to this deal, which you may think is bad, is war, and that's much worse, right? I mean, there's a lot of messaging. So how much of this is messaging, and how much of it is real strategy?
Well, there's no doubt that a large segment of our population is responding to the messages of the administration, not on the basis of a kind of rational analysis of what's going on in the Middle East, but simply in terms of their domestic affinities. So, I mean, one of the arguments that the president is making is that the neocon George W. Bush approach to the Middle East failed. We have to try something new, right? And say, let's try something new. So that immediately has a kind of common sense. Another argument you hear similar is, well, what's your solution, right? How are you going to solve Syria, you smart guy, right? And the answer is, sorry, I'm not going to solve Syria, right? I'm not going to solve Syria. I'm just saying that let's have a very clear definition of what U.S. vital interests are. Let's have a very clear definition of what the greatest threats to us are, and let's have policies with respect to Syria that minimize those threats. And I personally, I'm with David, and I presume with Matt as well, that a nuclear-armed Iran is the number one strategic threat that we have in the region, and we have to exert ourselves greatly to prevent that. The second thing I want to do is I want to defeat the Islamic State, and in order to do that, I have to have Sunni allies. An alignment with Iran doesn't allow me to destroy this. Now, I recognize, that for a lot of the people who are not following the Middle East closely, it is, when we're talking about centrifuges, is it 1,000 centrifuges, is it 6,104, and so on, it is like listening to a couple that are having a divorce, right? And when they come to you and they start, you don't know what he did to me, he did this, and then she comes and he comes and says, you don't know what she did this, and you look at that and you just go, oh, please, I can't sort that, I can't sort that out, and so you just pick the one that you're more sympathetic with. So, for a lot of people are listening to this like a divorce, and they say, well, I like Obama better than those neocon crazy guys. But the neocon crazy guys are reading the Middle East more clearly.
Matt, if you would, I agree. Matt, if you would, look, how dangerous is, not in terms of, as Mike framed it, as in terms of a divorcing couple, how many centrifuges, but how dangerous is a nuclear Iran? How much of a threat is that to American interest? And not just, we've talked about this a bit before, not just in the region, not just our regional interests, but here at home as well.
Yeah. Well, I think a nuclear armed Iran would pose a grave threat to U.S. interest, and I don't think there's really much disagreement on that. I mean, that's something the administration says as well. President Obama has spoken at length at some of the risks posed by a nuclear armed Iran. So a nuclear armed Iran, I think, would lead to further proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region. I don't think it would stop with a nuclear armed Iran. I think other countries would try to get nuclear weapons in response. Second, a nuclear armed Iran would be more aggressive. We know that Iran restrains its foreign policy now because it fears that if it goes too far, it might trigger an attack from Israel or from the United States. But with nuclear weapons, that could kind of serve as a shield that allows it to step up its support to terrorist and proxy groups, to engage in more aggressive course of diplomacy in the region, basically taking steps to become the most dominant state in the region, which is what Iran's leaders have said they want to do for some time. And then third, I think there's a real risk of nuclear war. And I don't think Iran's leaders are crazy. But if you have a nuclear-armed Iran and nuclear-armed Israel, potentially other nuclear-armed states in the region in the future, there are going to be political conflicts of interest. There are going to be high-stakes crises. And in those kind of situations, there's always the risk that things could spin out of control. So a nuclear-armed Iran, I think, does pose an existential threat to Israel. I don't think Israel's leaders are exaggerating when they say that. A couple of Iranian nuclear weapons on Israel could mean the end of the state of Israel. And once Iran has intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the east coast of the United States, a future U.S.-Iranian crisis could mean a nuclear attack on the U.S. homeland. Iran's working on ICBMs. The director of the Missile Defense Agency, U.S. Missile Defense Agency, said just a few weeks ago that Iran could have an ICBM capable of reaching the United States by the end of this year. Now, many people dispute that and say they're further away, but that's what a U.S. official has said recently. So I think this is a major threat, and we do need to do whatever it takes to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. Going back to your previous point, if I could, about what's different now between the Cold War.
I did want to, that's good.
So I think one of the things the administration thinks is different now is that nuclear weapons are less relevant than they used to be. And so President Obama has stated this vision of a world without nuclear weapons, which is, in my view, a little naive, but I do think that the president believes it, and I think it's one reason that he is concerned about a nuclear-armed Iran. I think that he understands that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, other countries might get nuclear weapons in response. That's deeply antithetical to this idea of a world without nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, I think he also badly wants to avoid starting a war against Iran, or having to be forced to the point of choosing between letting Iran have nuclear weapons or conduct airstrikes. And so I think maybe a few years ago, the administration thought that they would really solve the Iranian nuclear problem. I think now their best hope is to just pass this on to their successor. And so I think that's what a deal does. I don't think it solves the problem. I don't think it keeps Iran from building nuclear weapons. But assuming we get it, assuming Iran abides by it at least initially, I think it does mean that Iran probably doesn't acquire nuclear weapons before January 2017, but it leaves a hell of a problem for the next president.
I wanted to ask David something quickly because I want to open up for a question or two, but you wanted to follow up, and then
just two sentences.
Okay.
In response to what Matt says, I'm not 100% convinced that the president thinks a nuclear-armed Iran is a really big problem.
Okay.
Right. I just want to state that, and he has always said it, and it may well be the case that he thinks that. But it's worth noting that a very large percentage of people in the policy establishment in Washington, if asked this question, what is the worst outcome? What is the worst outcome? A war to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, or Iran getting a nuclear weapon? They would say a war to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon is the worst outcome. And Fareed Zakaria, just a couple of years ago, said whom the president has cited as somebody who has a lot of influence on his thinking. Fareed Zakaria,
or vice versa.
it goes like in a friendship, it goes both ways. If you think that Fareed Zakaria's columns sometimes reflect an efficient thinking, that's possible.
Is that how he's plagiarized?
Shush, stop. So anyway, the Fareed Zakaria, he said this, that it's not that big of a deal, and that we can live with it just like we live with the Russian bomb and the Chinese bomb and so on. And I think when he said that, he was reflecting the thoughts of many people in this town. They don't say it out loud because it is politically unacceptable on the Hill, and they know it will be politically self-defeating if they said it. But the president's thoughts in many respects are completely consistent with people who think this way. So I don't think it's outrageous. I don't think it's outrageous to say that he may himself entertain these thoughts. Obviously, he's never said them. I can't prove it, and so on. But I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. Did you want to follow up on that? Just follow up on that, but also I want you to keep in mind the question that I kind of kicked off this section with was like, so what's different now? And more specifically, are we still in the Cold War when we're talking about a polynuclear Middle East? Or is it something different? Is it less dangerous, less relevant?
I think
but also, again, if you do leave us a couple of minutes, because I want to ask make some room
so
for it.
quickly, it's been 25 years since the American political establishment had to think seriously about nuclear weapons. All of the questions that they have answered in the last 25 years have been relatively small bore questions like, how do you get the silly Ukrainians to give up all those Russian weapons that they have? Or let's sign this deal with the North Koreans and maybe it will work or maybe it won't. All of those questions were a far cry and very, very little comparative intellectual heft or political heft was devoted to those questions when you compare them with the big life or death Cold War questions involving a nuclear-armed Soviet Union and China. Our ability conceptually to grapple with those questions has very, very badly decayed. As a culture, we're not used to thinking about those things anymore. We don't have people who are highly placed who are paid to think about those questions. That kind of knowledge is not at the premium that it once was. I think that very shortly, this is one of the ironies of this administration may well be that a president who came into office talking about a nuclear-free planet is going to be responsible for the greatest surge of nuclear proliferation that we've seen, in half a century or more. You're looking not only at these very alarming reports about the pace at which the North Koreans have been making bombs. There was that article in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
You're also going to be looking at an Iranian nuclear program, a Saudi nuclear program. You're going to be looking at one or more nuclear programs in Asia. We will have set a precedent that we are not willing to stop those things. We're certainly not willing to use force to stop those things. And we will have a planet where it's not just a question of will the Russians use it, or will the Chinese use it, or will the Indians use it. You're going to have a multiplication of actors and conflicts, and I think that strategically that problem is going to be a much harder problem than gaming out how do you deter the Soviet Union. And I think that it's a problem that we all better start thinking about again.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up and see if there are any questions. Do we have a microphone? Maury? Actually, I want Maury to go first. Can you come down here, please? Thanks. Maury, can you identify yourself?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Maury Amate, identified with a number of organizations. Looking ahead, 21 months, has anyone done any analysis of what the inevitable Hillary might do, which is different than the current president faced with the situation, assuming there's no cataclysmic event before then?
Do you mean regarding the
Regarding
negotiations, the regional?
Regarding the a nuclear Iran, the region,
Right.
how she might
Yeah.
be differ from the current
Okay.
administration.
Thanks. Mike, do you want to take a stab at that?
I saw the statement by Haim Saban on Israeli television, which you probably saw as well, where he strongly suggested that she has a secret policy that is hostile to Obama's emergent deal. He said that she's very concerned about the safety of the state of Israel, and that he tells her things that make he who is now a critic of the president's policy. He said she tells him things that make him feel a lot better. But behind closed doors, and then
They have nothing to do with the nuclear negotiations.
the correspondent asked him to give greater details, and he said, "I just did." So that is all we know. She's reported to have a secret anti-Iran, anti-Obama policy. She herself has bought herself until June 30th. She put out a statement that was supportive of the president until June 30th. Sort of, wait, I'm heartened by the direction of things. Let's wait and see. One of the most important things that those of us who think it's a bad deal can do, I think, is influence her to come out. Even if she were just to say, like James Baker did. James Baker, who has also been very supportive of the deal in general, but James Baker wrote that op-ed last week in which he said, I'm seeing some things that are making me nervous, and if these continue, then it's not a good deal. Even if she did that, it would be very valuable because then a lot of Democrats on the Hill, in the expectation that she might be president, and knowing that President Obama is a lame duck president, they would start gravitating toward her like metal filings to a magnet. So she could open up a space for greater questioning and criticism on the Democratic side if she did it. But the simple answer to your question is, I don't think we really know anything about what she's really thinking, unless you believe that Haim Saban knows something we don't.
Can you come up, this gentleman over here in the corner? Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Darrell Kimball, Arms Control Association. There are a lot of things that were said about the nuclear negotiations that I would take issue with, but I just want to focus in on something that Matt was saying about your assertion that there is an alternative to the existing agreement, or the agreement that's still being negotiated, and that would be to test the Iranians to see if they would accept a zero enrichment program. You seem to have forgotten that was tested, even with a very tough sanctions regime in place after 2010. The Iranians were being called upon to halt enrichment since 2006 by the UN Security Council. Since then, they increased the number of centrifuges from a couple hundred to 20,000 today. Since 2010, they've doubled that number. It was about 10,000 in 2010. So, it seems rather implausible to suggest that they're going to capitulate after all that time not having capitulated.
I'm
now,
sorry, just
I would
if you
like
could
them.
just phrase that as a
But it's
question quickly,
important
thanks.
clarification in this
But
long
I mean,
discussion
he's
that
going
you've
to
had.
answer it. I just want you to ask us a question so we can get to
So my
that.
question is, how long do you think we should test such a proposition by, I suppose, walking away from the negotiation, and how quickly, and this is an engineering analysis and a political analysis, how long do you think it would be before the Iranians would have a capability that would allow them to amass enough fissile material for one bomb? I think it would be down from 2 to 3 months to a few weeks or days. So I'm just not sure that scenario is realistic.
Matt, do you want to address
Yeah,
that? Then
sure.
Mike wants to follow up with a quick
Yes.
response.
So as you pointed out, the real pressure wasn't put on Iran until really 2012 with the EU oil embargo and kicking them out of the banking system. And then only about a year later, they were willing to come to the table and start negotiations. And we started to let off the pressure with the minimal sanctions relief that we provided as part of the JPOA. So I think we let them up too early. I think if we had continued on that track with, yeah.
How long do you think it would take for the Iranians to double their enrichment capacity? How long do you think it would take before they would try on
So it would depend on how they develop their nuclear program. If they decided to dash to a nuclear weapons capability, as I said before, we think they're 2 to 3 months. I think more likely is they would go to the pattern of nuclear development we saw before 2013, where they slowly build up their program and try not to blatantly violate red lines that might invite an attack. And so some of the estimates I've seen there is that it would take a year or so for them to get to the kind of undetectable breakout scenario. And so I think what we'd have to do is bring additional pressure to bear through sanctions, but make it clear that if they cross these real red lines for us, that we are prepared to use military force. And I think if we do that, that it's unlikely that they would actually cross those red lines. And so essentially we'd be playing a game of chicken then. Who's going to swerve first? Are we going to come off our red line of no enrichment, or are they going to come off of theirs? And given that all of the cards are in our hand, I think it's likely that they would swerve first. I think if we show leadership and work with them and explain the rationale, that we can get our allies on board.
I just think it's interesting the way that you're asking the question, the way you keep coming back, because the alternative must necessarily lead to, I keep telling you, this is as good as it's going to get. And that is the way the administration phrases it, and the administration is giving away the better part of negotiations by virtue of that, by indicating there is no way we're ever going to use military force.
Actually,
And we keep telling you,
practical question that is the logical one based upon what he said. Okay, that's what I'm asking.
Mike, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead. We'll get another.
Can we ask this gentleman up here?
It's been a very interesting discussion. It reminds me that nobody in Hollywood, whether writing for Hitchcock or writing for Rod Serling, could write a script from what you were talking about this morning or describing what's going on in the Middle East.
David is working on that
Right.
script.
Charlie Krautheimer wrote this morning that this country is enabling Iran. It's lifted it from a pretty low position to our level. We are the strongest country in the world, militarily, economically, wherever you want. Why have we done that? Are we so ignorant, so naive? Why are we willing to sacrifice Saudi Arabia, Israel, other countries in the region for this two-bit country, which is a rogue regime, which is a Shiite regime? And if you look at their platform, we're going to dominate the world. Are we so ignorant in this case?
Well, I'm going to ask David to answer that as our closing moment. But I just wanted to say I hope you weren't using Shiite regime disparagingly. There's nothing wrong with this. It's not a sectarian audience, and the United States is not a government that believes in parceling things out in terms of sectarianism. So it's a revolutionary regime has that, and a problematic regime for the United States. But rogue is fine. Rogue is fine. David, would you like to try to find a way to address the?
I think that I think two things that Michael said earlier are worth highlighting in this area. The first is the suspicion that lots of people in the administration, and I'd say in Washington more broadly, do not see a nuclear-armed Iran as the worst thing that could happen in the world. There's a tendency to see nuclear weapons now as symbols of national pride or achievement. There has been a falling away in general of our sense that these are real weapons that have catastrophic effects when they're used. And I think that frame for analysis is a very dangerous one, and I think it's become very common. I think the second thing that Michael said that's worth highlighting is that, and I'd say that this consensus goes well beyond the Obama administration in Washington now, the idea of another quote-unquote war in the Middle East is seen as the ultimate thing that American policy must avoid at all costs. And Matthew's answer, while a responsible one, was also a little evasive on that point, because the point that any person who doesn't want to look crazy in this present debate has to stop short of is saying that it is possible to imagine a military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. the paradoxical logic of strategy will tell you that if you are incapable of imagining that, then there is no way to succeed in these negotiations. Either that is on the table or it's not. If it's not on the table, then you may as well sign whatever agreement is there to be
We get
signed.
into this logic where it's like,
And
this
because
is the
because
best deal.
now that's not saying that one should. And the administration, you've watched them many times try to feint and say, well, we are willing and it's still on the table and we will use it, except of course we won't because we're not crazy. And that's not really a credible threat of the use of force. Now, the most recent example of U.S. military intervention in the region is the war in Iraq. I think Michael and I probably differ about that war. I think that war was a disaster for the United States, and I think it was a disaster for the region. However, that's hardly the only use of military force that the United States has ever attempted in the Middle East. There was the first Iraq War. I don't think anyone looks at that and says that was the great disaster for American policy in the region. And I don't think anyone looks at Bill Clinton's operation, what was it called? Desert Fox, was it
Yes.
called, in 97, right? Which people presented here at the time as a wag the tail, wag the dog exercise to cover up the Monica Lewinsky scandal or whatever it was, but which turns out in retrospect to have had a relatively significant effect on still existing components of their WMD program. And so this town is uniquely focused on one metaphor, one example of what American force in the region looks like. It's a particularly disastrous example. I don't think that example is particularly applicable here. I don't think anyone's talking about a land invasion of Iran and occupying it and trying to spread democracy through American force of arms to Iran. That all sounds insane to everybody. And so the inability to get past that metaphor is also a huge problem. That's what I'd say.
Thanks. That is going to bring the panel to a close this afternoon. I want to thank the three of you, and I want to thank you all for coming. Thanks very much.
Thank you.